The frozen night settles over old Russia like a heavy velvet curtain, quieting the world until all that remains is the soft hum of distant winds brushing against the wooden walls of Moscow's ancient fortresses. It is in this silence, in this deep and endless winter calm, that the legend of a ruler begins to stir. People say that if you listen closely on nights like this, you can almost hear the echoes of footsteps in long-abandoned corridors, the faint clatter of armor, or a whisper slipping through the cold air, a whisper carrying the name of a man who would become feared across 2 continents. Ivan. A name that would one day carry the weight of empires, written in equal parts admiration and terror. The story unfolds slowly, like candlelight pushing through darkness, illuminating fragments of a world shaped by ambition and fear. Imagine the Kremlin in the mid-1500s, towering white stone, onion domes glinting beneath the moon, and sentries pacing along the frozen ramparts. Lanterns flicker behind narrow windows, casting tall, trembling shadows that stretch across the icy courtyards. Within these walls lives a ruler whose presence can quiet a room, whose gaze can stop a man's heart. Yet tonight, before the storms of his reign, we approach his story gently, like stepping closer to a sleeping giant, unsure whether our footsteps will rouse something we cannot control. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, did not begin his journey as a monster nor as a tyrant. In the beginning, he was a child of destiny, born in a land heavy with prophecy and unrest, where power was a fragile thing and loyalty even more brittle. But the whispers that would one day define him, the fears, the stories, the myths, were already growing. Servants spoke them behind closed doors, nobles muttered them with caution, and travelers carried them from village to village. A boy touched by brilliance and shadow. A ruler who could pray like a saint and punish like a storm. A man both guided and haunted. Tonight, we invite the listener to drift deeper into this world, where the lines between myth and memory blend like ink in water. This is not a whirlwind tale of battles or violence, instead, it is a quiet walk through the corridors of Ivan's early legend, painted softly and carefully. Every step forward reveals another side of him, the fearsome czar, the lonely child, the visionary, the ruler who could command armies yet struggled to control the turmoil inside himself. As we move, the snow continues to fall outside, cushioning the land in a thick white blanket that muffles every sound, as if even nature hesitates to disturb the memories we are about to uncover. The whispers grow stronger with every passing moment. Some say Ivan's power was unmatched because he believed he was chosen by God himself, destined to forge Russia into something greater, something unified and unshakable. Others claim that fear was the foundation of his strength, the fear he inspired, the fear he carried, and the fear that clung to every corner of his realm. But legends are never simple, and neither was the man behind them. To understand him, we must begin at the very edge of his story, where darkness meets the faintest spark of light. Picture him in the earliest memories of his reign, a tall figure robed in rich fabrics, eyes sharp and restless, pacing through the palace chambers. His thoughts are heavy, yet he moves with the confidence of someone who knows the world will bend to his will. Outside those chambers, boyars gather, whispering among themselves, uncertain of what the future will bring. For the first time, Russia has a leader who calls himself Tsar of all Russia, a title that carries ancient symbolism and immeasurable weight. It is a declaration not just of authority, but of destiny. And destiny, once claimed, cannot be easily escaped. Still, in these early moments of the tale, we hold the energy gently, like a flickering ember. The calm rhythm of the night soothes the edges of the harsher truths yet to come. We allow the listener to breathe, to settle, to let their imagination wander through the quiet world of 16th-century Russia. The air tastes of frost and pine. The city sleeps deeply, unaware of the storms that will one day shake its foundations. And within the palace walls, Ivan stands at the crossroads of his life, one path leading toward greatness, the other toward darkness. What he chooses will echo far beyond his lifetime, far beyond his empire. For now, though, the story remains suspended in a peaceful moment before the rise. The legend is still forming, shaping itself in the stillness of the night. And as we drift slowly through these opening scenes, the tension is subtle, a soft pulse beneath the calm narration. Something is coming. Something powerful, transformative, and unforgettable. The kind of force that shapes nations and haunts them for generations. But for this moment, the world holds its breath, waiting for the first step of a journey that will redefine the meaning of fear, power, and legacy. And so we begin, not with thunder, but with a whisper carried through the winter air, one that speaks of a ruler whose name the world will remember, a man whose story demands to be told slowly, carefully, and with the respect due to a figure carved into the very bones of history. As the night deepens and the listener settles further into stillness, we follow that whisper into the heart of a life both extraordinary and tragic, stepping quietly into the tale of Ivan the Terrible, the Russian boss whose shadow stretched across 2 continents. The palace where Ivan spent his earliest years was grand to the outside world, but to the young boy wandering its halls, it felt more like a maze of shadows, cold, echoing, and filled with dangers he could sense long before he understood them. He was born into royalty, yes, but not into safety. From the moment he could walk, he stepped into a world shaped by betrayal, hungry ambitions, and the silent war for power that raged behind closed doors. The boy who would one day command armies first learned how to survive not with a sword, but with silence, observation, and patience. When Ivan was just 3 years old, his father, Grand Prince Vasily III, died suddenly, leaving behind a fragile political structure held together only by fear and opportunism. The boy was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow, but the title meant little when the real power settled into the hands of the ambitious boyar families, powerful nobles who saw the orphan child as nothing more than a convenient symbol. In the ballroom, they bowed to him. In the council chambers, they ignored him. And in the dark corners of the palace, they plotted against one another in ways the child would one day mimic on a far grander scale. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, tried desperately to protect him. For a few short years, she ruled as regent and shielded Ivan from the cruelty of the court. But her sudden death, believed by many to be the result of poisoning, left the young boy completely alone. The moment she was gone, the palace transformed from a place of guarded warmth into a playground for wolves. The boyars seized control, each faction clawing at the throne, and Ivan became a prisoner in his own home, watched constantly, manipulated quietly, and cared for only when it benefited someone's political advantage. Life in the palace now meant wandering long hallways with patched clothing while the nobles dined in luxury. Servants, once loyal to his mother, were scattered or executed. Ivan learned early that people who smiled during the day whispered threats in the night. He saw violence not as a shocking exception but as a daily occurrence, men dragged away for disobedience, servants beaten in front of him to make a point, allies turning into enemies in the span of a whispered rumor. For a child absorbing the world like a sponge, these scenes etched themselves into the very core of his developing mind. But the palace was not entirely devoid of comfort. Ivan found refuge in books, particularly religious texts and chronicles of past rulers. In dusty libraries lit by wavering candlelight, he read about leaders who commanded armies, conquered lands, or claimed power through divine right. The stories filled the emptiness inside him with purpose and gave him a vision of himself, one far greater than a lonely child ignored by those meant to serve him. When he read about the ancient Byzantine emperors, he became enamored with the idea of authority as both sacred and absolute. Power was not just desired, it was ordained. As he grew, something else developed alongside his intelligence, a sharp awareness of human nature. He noticed how the boyars pretended kindness when they needed his signature on documents. He saw how they quarreled among themselves, each convinced they could outsmart the others. This taught him a lesson he never forgot, that power was taken, not given, and that fear was a more reliable tool than love. The seeds of paranoia that would one day define his rule were planted here, in the years where every embrace was conditional and every smile had a hidden edge. Despite the chaos around him, Ivan displayed flashes of the brilliant ruler he could become. He was perceptive, gifted in memory, and able to read people with uncanny accuracy. But he also carried a quiet anger, a simmering sense of injustice born from years of humiliation. He saw nobles wearing silk while he wore worn-out robes. He watched them feast while he waited for scraps. Each slight, each insult, formed another layer of resentment, hardening his spirit like frost layering over a pond until it is thick enough to hold weight, or to crack violently. When he turned 13, something inside him shifted. The boy who had watched silently for years reached a breaking point. On a cold winter day, Ivan ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuaysky, one of the boyars who had openly mistreated him. To the shock of the court, Ivan commanded that Shuaysky be thrown to the hunting dogs. It was a brutal act from someone so young, but it sent a message through the palace like a bolt of lightning: the child prince was done enduring. From that moment, a new Ivan emerged, one who understood that the only way to survive was to strike first, harder than anyone expected. Yet beneath this fierce awakening still lived the wounded child shaped by fear and isolation. His cruelty was not without origin, it grew from the emotional scars carved during years when no one protected him. The palace corridors that echoed with the footsteps of conspiring nobles also echoed in his memories long into adulthood, guiding his every decision. Every betrayal he experienced in these early years hardened his belief that only absolute power could keep him safe. As the boyars squabbled and shifted alliances, Ivan began watching them with newfound clarity. He studied their weaknesses, their desires, their rivalries. Each observation sharpened him, preparing him for the future he envisioned, a future where he would no longer be the puppet, but the master. And though he was still young, the shadows of the palace had already taught him the cost of trusting the wrong people. These lessons would follow him like ghosts throughout his life, shaping him into a ruler both feared and misunderstood. The child who walked those dark halls, thin, cold, and wary, would one day rise to become the first Tsar of all. Russia. But in these early years, long before crowns and invasions and terror, Ivan was simply a young boy learning to navigate a world where kindness was rare and power was everything. Every whisper, every betrayal, every lonely night spent in the cold fortress of Moscow slowly sculpted him into the man history would never forget. And as he grew, the wolves around him failed to see that the child they underestimated was studying them quietly, preparing for the day he would no longer hide in the shadows, but rise from them. The transformation from a frightened boy to a calculating young ruler did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, like frost gradually tightening its grip over the Russian countryside. In the dim corners of the Kremlin, where candles burned low and whispers traveled through stone walls, Ivan began to observe the world with a new kind of clarity. He was no longer merely surviving, he was learning. Every betrayal became a lesson. Every sideways glance, every hushed conversation, every shift in the power structure taught him something about human nature and the mechanics of authority. And with each passing year, the seeds of the ruler he would become took deeper root. Even as a child, Ivan's mind was remarkably sharp. He memorized scriptures, political treaties, military strategies, and stories of ancient rulers with an intensity that startled the few tutors who paid attention to him. Books were his sanctuary, windows into worlds where leaders forged empires with intelligence, strategy, and force. He read about Alexander the Great, the Byzantine emperors, and the early princes of Rus, absorbing their triumphs and failures. In those pages, he found role models who were not vulnerable, not ignored, not powerless. They were decisive, commanding, unchallenged. And more than anything, Ivan craved that certainty. By the time he reached adolescence, his observations had sharpened into something far more deliberate. He watched the boyars not with fear but with silent analysis. He noted how one noble's flattery masked resentment, how another's loyalty shifted depending on who held advantage that week. He understood that promises meant little in the palace and that alliances were as fragile as the winter ice on the Moskva River. These lessons, imprinted deeply, would shape his ideas about governance in ways the world would later call ruthless. Despite the bitterness of his upbringing, Ivan had moments of surprising warmth. He cherished stories told by old servants, enjoyed playful conversations with young courtiers, and admired the beauty of Russian Orthodox rituals. The glow of church candles, the echo of chants, and the comfort of ritual gave him a sense of belonging he rarely found elsewhere. Religion became a powerful influence in his life, not just spiritually but politically. He began to see himself the way many medieval rulers did, as a chosen instrument of God. This idea, once planted, grew steadily, strengthening his belief that his future authority would be not only legal but divine. But his intellectual growth came hand in hand with emotional scars. The years of neglect, the hunger for affection, and the constant fear of betrayal twisted inside him like an unhealed wound. His temper, quick and intense, became more visible as he aged. There were moments when he lashed out unexpectedly, throwing objects, issuing threats, or delivering punishments that startled even his supporters. These bursts were not constant, but they were unpredictable, like cracks appearing in stone under pressure. Each outburst hinted at a storm building within him that neither youth nor inexperience could fully explain. Underneath his anger, however, lay a relentless ambition. Ivan did not want to rule as a figurehead. He wanted to command. To reform. To reshape Russia into something stronger and more unified than a fragmented state he had inherited. Watching the boyars tear at each other for scraps of power convinced him that only a strong central authority could bring stability to his kingdom. This idea, one he formed in adolescence and nurtured into adulthood, would become one of the defining pillars of his reign. As he approached his teenage years, Ivan began to test the boundaries of his status. He issued small commands, observed how the nobles reacted, and pushed back when they challenged him. Sometimes they mocked him behind his back. Sometimes they ignored him. But every time they dismissed him, Ivan's resolve hardened. He understood something the boyars did not. He was waiting for the right moment, the moment when he could seize power decisively and show them all the mistake they made in underestimating him. He began choosing allies more carefully. Among the clergy, he found a few men who believed in his potential and offered guidance. Among the military class, he saw loyalty where the nobles offered manipulation. These relationships were not yet powerful enough to tilt the balance, but they gave Ivan a sense that he was not completely alone. More importantly, they taught him that authority could be built outside the noble families who had dominated Moscow for generations. As his understanding of power deepened, so did his interest in the symbols of leadership. Ivan became fascinated with coronations, ceremonies, and the rituals of authority. He practiced speeches privately, rehearsed how a ruler should walk, how he should speak, how he should command respect. Servants sometimes found him standing before mirrors, draped in fabrics, imagining himself as a true sovereign. This was not childish fantasy. It was preparation. In these years, Ivan's dual nature began to fully emerge. On one side was the thoughtful young prince who read voraciously and listened intently. On the other was the wounded child who still carried anger and mistrust. His intelligence was undeniable, but so was the turbulence beneath it. Those who interacted with him often left unsure which Ivan they had encountered, the disciplined thinker or the unpredictable youth shaped by trauma. The palace, still full of scheming nobles, failed to see how quickly he was changing. They still thought of him as the silent boy who roamed the halls unnoticed. But Ivan was no longer simply watching, he was preparing. He understood the political landscape better than most adults. He recognized which houses were rising and which were declining. He knew which nobles feared him and which ones underestimated him. And he began quietly organizing his thoughts around one central question: when the time came, how would he claim the authority he believed was rightfully his? That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. By the time Ivan reached 13, the transformation was complete enough for action. He was no longer the frightened child curled in corners for protection. He was a teenager with sharp perception, fierce intelligence, and a growing appetite for control. When he ordered the execution of Prince Shuaisky, the boyar who had tormented him openly, it was a revelation. Not just to the nobles who witnessed it, but to Ivan himself. He realized he had the power to act, to punish, to command, to reshape the world around him. This act marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. It was the spark that ignited the flame of his future reign. The careful student of power had now taken his first decisive step into authority. And though the world did not know it yet, the young prince shaped by shadows was preparing to become something far more formidable, the first Tsar of all Russia, a ruler whose name would echo through history with a fear and fascination few leaders would ever match. Ivan's early years had forged him through pain, betrayal, observation, and ambition. Now, with the knowledge he gathered and the fire burning inside him, he was ready to begin the climb toward a throne that had waited for him since birth. And the world, unprepared and unaware, was about to meet the ruler those years had created. The morning of Ivan's coronation began with a silence so profound it seemed as if all of Moscow held its breath. A soft winter mist drifted through the air, settling gently on rooftops and cloaking the city in a pale, ghostly glow. The streets were lined with people who had gathered long before sunrise, their fur-lined coats dusted with frost as they waited for a glimpse of the boy who would become something Russia had never seen before. Word traveled like a soft ripple through the crowd, "The prince is ready. The procession will begin soon." Even those who had doubted him, those who whispered about his temper or his youth, felt a stirring of curiosity, perhaps even awe. Something historic was unfolding. Inside the cathedral, warm candlelight pushed against the heavy morning dimness. The air was thick with incense, sweet, smoky, and sacred. Chanting echoed from the choir, a low melodic hum that wrapped itself around the ancient stone arches and made the entire space feel otherworldly. Priests in shimmering robes moved gracefully between altars, preparing the icons, relics, and ceremonial objects that had been arranged with reverent precision. They knew this day marked not just the crowning of a ruler but the birth of a new kind of authority, one that would change Russia forever. Ivan, now 16, approached the cathedral with a calmness that almost seemed unreal for someone who had endured so much. Gone was the frightened child of the palace corridors. Gone was the awkward boy hiding bruises beneath his sleeves. In his place stood a young man tall and composed, draped in robes embroidered with gold thread that caught and reflected the soft glow of candles. His gaze was steady, sharp yet introspective, aware of the weight of the moment pressing upon him. Every step he took across the cold stone floor echoed with the confidence of someone who believed deeply, perhaps too deeply, that destiny had chosen him. As he moved toward the altar, the gathered nobles bowed, though many did so reluctantly. They still remembered the years when they had manipulated him, used him, underestimated him. Now, they watched with unreadable expressions, uncertain of what this transformation signaled for their own futures. There was a power in Ivan's presence today that none of them could ignore. A sense of inevitability surrounded him, like a storm quietly forming on the horizon. The coronation ceremony began with ancient prayers, their rhythmic cadences rolling through the cathedral like waves. Ivan listened intently, absorbing every word. He had dreamed of this moment for years, not just the recognition, but the symbolic transformation it represented. Today, he would not be crowned Grand Prince, as rulers before him had been. Today, he would take a title no Russian leader had ever claimed, Tsar of all Russia. Derived from Caesar, it connected him to the mighty rulers of Rome and Byzantium, empires he admired and studied. In choosing this title, he declared that Russia was no longer merely a fragmented land of competing princes but a unified and divinely ordained empire. The Metropolitan of Moscow approached with the monomachus cap, an ancient crown linked to legends of Byzantine emperors. The moment the crown descended onto Ivan's head, the cathedral seemed to exhale. The choir's voices rose in a bright, soaring chant, filling every corner of the sacred space with sound. Nobles bowed more deeply. Soldiers outside raised their weapons in salute. Bells throughout Moscow began to ring, deep, powerful tones that trembled through the icy air, echoing across frozen rivers and snow-covered fields. Ivan's expression hardly changed, but inside him something undeniable stirred. For years he had been shaped by fear, neglect, and chaos. Today, he felt something different: clarity, strength, purpose. The weight of the crown did not crush him, it anchored him. In that moment, he believed he had been chosen not only by tradition but by divine will. The power he had envisioned as a lonely child finally sat firmly in his hands. As the ceremony continued, Ivan received symbols of authority, the orb representing earthly power, the scepter symbolizing justice, the sword of the state signifying his right to defend and rule. Each object added another layer to the transformation he was undergoing. These were not simply relics, they were affirmations of the role he was stepping into. The Tsar was not merely a ruler but a father to the nation, a protector of the church, and the ultimate keeper of order. After the blessings were complete, Ivan addressed the gathered nobles and clergy. His voice was calm and resonant, carrying easily through the vaulted cathedral. He spoke of unity, of strength, of his vision for Russia as a great and powerful nation. To the clergy, he promised protection. To the military, he promised purpose. To the nobles, he offered acknowledgement but no guarantees. Those listening could sense that the young man standing before them was no longer content with being a figurehead. The authority he claimed today was absolute. When Ivan stepped out of the cathedral, the cold air greeted him again. Thousands of people filled the square, pressing close together for warmth as they stared at their newly crowned Tsar. Some cheered, some prayed, and some simply watched in stunned silence. To the common folk, Ivan represented hope, a strong leader who could bring stability after years of chaos. They did not know the complexities lurking inside him. They saw only the regal figure emerging with snowflakes settling gently on his fur-lined mantle. The procession back to the Kremlin unfolded slowly, accompanied by music and the rhythmic stomping of soldiers' boots. Ivan rode calmly, holding himself with quiet authority, his gaze moving over the crowd. In those faces, hopeful, weary, curious, he saw the enormity of what he had taken on. But he did not flinch. If anything, his posture grew stronger, straighter. Determination radiated from him as clearly as the gold threads woven through his garments. This day marked a turning point not just in Ivan's life but in the history of Russia itself. The coronation solidified his transformation from orphan prince to sovereign Tsar. It marked the end of the boyars' unchecked dominance and the beginning of centralized power under a single ruler. For Ivan, it was the moment he finally stepped out of the shadows of his childhood and into the blazing light of destiny. Of course, none present could fully understand the magnitude of what had begun. They could not see the triumphs he would achieve, nor the darkness he would unleash. But for now, the moment remained suspended in quiet grandeur, a young man crowned in gold, standing before his people with the weight of a nation on his shoulders and the haunting certainty that his reign would be remembered for centuries to come. The frost still clung to the air, the bells still rang their solemn melodies, and the legend of the first Tsar of all Russia had officially begun. In the first years after his coronation, Ivan stepped into his role with a surprising calmness, almost as if the storm of his childhood had settled temporarily, giving way to a clear and focused sky. The young Tsar, despite the trauma etched into his past, was determined to prove that he could be more than the frightened boy who once hid behind palace curtains or watched nobles battle over scraps of influence. Now crowned and empowered, he began shaping Russia according to a vision he had quietly built for years, a strong, unified state capable of matching the great empires he had read about in the pages of history. These early years of Ivan's rule are often overlooked because the darkness of his later life cast such a long, dramatic shadow. Yet it is in this period that we see the brightest version of Ivan, the reformer, the modernizer, the idealistic leader who genuinely believed he could transform Russia for the better. To understand the full complexity of his legacy, it's important to linger in this rare window of light, where ambition and hope worked hand in hand. One of Ivan's first priorities was to reorganize the legal system. Russia's laws had been a chaotic mix of old customs, local traditions, and vague decrees that varied wildly from one region to another. Ivan, driven by his desire for order, initiated the creation of a more structured legal code. In 1550, he introduced the Sudebnik, a comprehensive law code that standardized justice across the nation. It aimed to reduce corruption, restrain abuses by nobles, and clarify the rights of landowners and peasants. While far from perfect, it marked a significant step toward centralizing authority under the Tsar and reducing the chaotic rule of local lords. He also strengthened the military. Ivan understood that a fragmented nation was vulnerable, and he believed a strong central army was essential to Russia's survival. Under his rule, the Streltsy, a professional military corps armed with firearms, began to take shape. For a country still transitioning out of medieval traditions, this was revolutionary. These new soldiers were loyal directly to the Tsar, not to individual nobles, increasing the stability of his growing centralized power. Ivan also improved communication systems between military units, refined training practices, and expanded the recruitment of skilled fighters. Infrastructure, too, became an area of focus. In Moscow, construction flourished. Wooden buildings were replaced with stronger structures, new churches rose with colorful domes that shone under the Russian sun, trade routes were fortified and improved. Ivan believed that a strong Russia needed strong cities and stable roads, paths that not only moved goods but carried the message of unity throughout the land. He encouraged craftsmen, architects, and merchants to contribute to the cultural and economic vitality of his capital. These developments helped Moscow transform from a city constantly threatened by internal strife into a more cohesive and vibrant center of power. But perhaps one of Ivan's most impressive early achievements was his work on the Zemsky Sobor, a kind of early national assembly. Unlike the narrow, self-interested boyar councils that had dominated politics in his youth, this assembly included not only nobles but also clergy and representatives from towns. Its creation signaled a radical shift in how decisions could be made in Russia. While the Tsar still held supreme power, he opened a channel through which the broader voices of the realm could be heard. This move hinted at a ruler who, at least at this stage, valued consultation and cooperation. These reforms were not merely administrative. They were deeply personal. Each law rewritten, every military unit formed, every council reshaped was another brick in the foundation of the Russia Ivan believed he was destined to build. The neglect and humiliation of his childhood had forged a ruler obsessed with structure, stability, and absolute control, qualities that, for now, created order rather than destruction. Even outside of politics, Ivan showed qualities of a thoughtful and cultured leader. He was well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply interested in theology, philosophy, and the arts. He assembled a team of scribes to translate foreign texts, encouraging the flow of knowledge into Russia. His court welcomed scholars, musicians, and craftsmen. He oversaw the printing of the first Russian books using movable type, an enormous step for education and literacy in the country. In these early years, he carried himself less like a tyrant and more like a Renaissance ruler shaping a modern state. The people of Russia noticed the change. Common citizens began to see Ivan as a leader who cared about the country's progress, not just its crown. His reforms offered consistency where there had once been chaos. Trade increased. Crime decreased. The economy strengthened gradually. For the first time in decades, ordinary Russians felt the presence of a government that extended beyond the palace walls, something steady, predictable, and promising. Yet beneath these achievements, subtle warning signs remained. Ivan's temper, though controlled for now, still flickered at unpredictable moments. His distrust of nobles had not vanished, it had merely been channeled into reforms that limited their influence. At times, he pushed himself into exhaustive micromanagement, unable to fully rely on anyone. And deep inside, a quiet, unresolved grief still lived, grief for his parents, for the childhood he never had, for the years spent alone in a palace of enemies. This mixture of brilliance and instability, of ambition and insecurity, created a delicate balance within Ivan, one that would not last forever. But in these early years, the balance held, allowing Russia to move forward under the guidance of a ruler who genuinely wanted to elevate his nation. As Ivan continued to govern with fresh energy, he began envisioning a Russia that was not just stable but powerful, a nation that could stand proudly alongside the great European empires. His mind turned toward expansion, toward trade routes that would bring wealth, and toward strategic victories that would secure Russia's place on the world stage. The brightness of this period was real, but it also served as a contrast for what was coming. The reforms, the hope, the order, they painted the picture of a ruler with immense potential. But the same intensity that fueled Ivan's brilliance would one day fuel his downfall. For now, however, Russia basked in the glow of a young Tsar who seemed ready to lead it into a new age, unaware that the seeds of fear and power planted in his past were quietly waiting for their moment to rise. The calm before the storm had settled across the land, and while no one could yet see the gathering darkness, the future was already beginning to shift. In the early years of Ivan's reign, those rare years when light still found its way through the cracks of his troubled heart, there was one presence that softened him more than any advisor, priest, or reform ever could. Her name was Anastasia Romanovna. To the world, she was a noblewoman chosen from a group of potential brides, but to Ivan, she became something far more profound, a sanctuary, a quiet harbor in the storm that had been his life. Where others saw the Tsar as a ruler or a threat, Anastasia saw the human beneath the crown, the young man still scarred by the shadows of his childhood. Their story begins not with dramatic passion but with gentle familiarity. When Anastasia first entered the palace, she carried herself with a calm grace that stood in stark contrast to the tense and restless air of the court. Her presence felt almost restorative, as if she brought with her a warmth the palace had long forgotten. She spoke softly, moved quietly, and listened with a patience Ivan had never experienced. Her manner didn't shift according to political advantage or fear, she didn't flinch at his temper, nor did she flatter him with false praise. Instead, she offered something far rarer, sincerity. Ivan noticed her before he fully understood why. In a court filled with calculating nobles, Anastasia was like a candle flame, steady, warm, and unexpectedly bright. She carried no ambitions of manipulation, no hidden schemes behind her gentle expressions. It was this simplicity, this authenticity, that drew Ivan toward her. He found himself speaking to her in ways he had never spoken to anyone, about his thoughts, his worries, his responsibilities. She listened, not out of obligation but out of genuine concern, and her presence gave him a sense of peace he had never known. Their marriage, celebrated with grand ceremony, marked one of the most hopeful chapters in Ivan's life. The wedding feast lasted days, filled with music, dancing, laughter, and prayers for the newlyweds. But the true significance of their union was not in the public spectacle, it was in the private transformation Ivan underwent. Those closest to him noticed the shift almost immediately. His temper cooled. His paranoia faded, if only slightly. He smiled more often, small, quiet smiles reserved for moments when Anastasia was near. In her company, he became more patient, more thoughtful, more willing to trust. Anastasia influenced him in subtle yet powerful ways. She encouraged him to approach decisions with calm reflection rather than impulsive reaction. When he felt anger rising, she gently guided him back to reason. When he felt overwhelmed, she grounded him. Her advice was never loud or forceful, it was soft, consistent, and rooted in compassion. In this way, she became the emotional balance that Ivan had lacked since childhood. The court saw the effects clearly. Under Anastasia's influence, Ivan's early reign flourished. His reforms were more measured, his counsel more open to discussion. While he remained firm and ambitious, he was not yet ruled by fear. Even the boyars, who had long feared his unpredictability, acknowledged that the Tsar was more stable with Anastasia by his side. She was the quiet force that helped temper his darker impulses and amplify his desire to rule wisely. Their home life reflected this newfound warmth. Ivan, who had never experienced a loving family, cherished the simple moments, meals shared without tension, conversations by candlelight, walks through palace gardens where laughter replaced the whispers of political schemes. Anastasia gave him something he had never dared hope for, a sense of belonging. She made the palace feel less like a battlefield and more like a home. When their first children were born, Ivan experienced emotions he had not known he was capable of. He held them with a tenderness that surprised even himself, marveling at their small hands and quiet breaths. These peaceful moments, rare and precious, strengthened his bond with Anastasia. For the first time, he felt the possibility of a life defined not by trauma but by love and stability. But even in these blissful years, the roots of future darkness were subtly shifting beneath the surface. Ivan, though calmer, was still deeply scarred. He had endured too much betrayal, too much loneliness. At times, he questioned the motives of those around him, fearing that the harmony he found with Anastasia was too fragile to last. And in a sense, he was right. The world beyond their chamber doors was never as peaceful as the moments they shared. There were whispers among the nobles, quiet murmurs that grew stronger with each passing year. Some feared Anastasia's influence, believing she softened the Tsar too much. Others envied her place beside him. A few even resented the stability she had brought, preferring the uncertainty they could exploit. Though Anastasia herself was gentle and unassuming, her effect on Ivan threatened the old power structures. And in the unpredictable world of palace politics, anything that shifted the balance of power became a target. For now, though, these threats remained subtle, like faint tremors beneath a still surface. Ivan continued to rely on Anastasia's counsel, valuing her wisdom as deeply as her kindness. Their relationship grew stronger with time, grounding Ivan in ways no advisor or relative could. When he faced difficult decisions, he often turned to her first. When calamity struck the nation, she remained his steady support. Her love did not erase Ivan's darkness, but it illuminated parts of him the world rarely saw. She brought out his potential for gentleness, for empathy, for meaningful leadership. With Anastasia, he became the best version of himself, the version Russia admired and history often forgets. These years of quiet love and growing stability formed a soft glow in Ivan's turbulent life, a warmth that history would later remember with bittersweet nostalgia. For it was Anastasia's presence, more than any political alliance or strategic reform, that anchored him firmly in a period of hope. And though neither of them knew it yet, the peace she brought would not last. The light she cast over Ivan's life would soon be threatened by forces neither could fully foresee. In the calm of their early marriage, they could not imagine the storm that would one day break across the empire, unraveling the harmony they had built together. But for this moment, this fleeting, golden chapter, Anastasia was his solace, his compass, and the one person who could quiet the echoes of his past. In her presence, even the most feared Tsar in Russian history found a space where he could simply be human. The death of Anastasia Romanovna marked the moment when the steady, glowing light at the center of Ivan's life flickered, and then went out entirely. What followed was not an immediate explosion of rage or madness, but something far more haunting, a slow, consuming unraveling of a man who had finally tasted peace, only to have it torn away. Her loss did not just break his heart, it reopened every old wound he had ever endured, every betrayal, every lonely night spent in cold palace corridors. And in the echo of her absence, the shadows that had once shaped him began to rise again, darker, sharper, and more merciless than before. Anastasia had fallen ill suddenly. At first, the court tried to remain hopeful, believing that Tsaritsa would recover with rest and prayer. Ivan sat beside her bed for hours at a time, refusing food, refusing counsel, his fingers gently brushing her hand as her strength faded. He called for the best doctors in the land, priests from the holiest monasteries, and healers who mixed herbs with whispered prayers. Nothing eased her suffering. Nothing slowed the sickness that seemed to drain her life by the hour. And when she finally passed, the quiet sob that left Ivan's lips was unlike any sound those walls had ever heard, a sound filled with grief so deep it bordered on terror. But grief was not the only emotion that took hold of him. Very quickly, suspicion seeped in. Ivan had always carried the remnants of paranoia within him, a lingering consequence of the treachery he witnessed as a child. With Anastasia's death, that buried fear burst to the surface, overwhelming the parts of him that had once trusted, loved, and hoped. Whispers began circulating around the court almost immediately, rumors that she had been poisoned, that boyars resentful of her influence had conspired to weaken the Tsar by striking at his heart. Whether these rumors had truth behind them or were the fabrications of fearful nobles hardly mattered. Ivan heard them, and once he did, they rooted themselves deeply inside him. He could not shake the idea that his beloved had been taken from him. Not by illness, but by human hands. And in Ivan's mind, if someone could harm Anastasia, no one in his court could be trusted, not advisors, not servants, not even those who had once stood close to him. The mourning period that followed was unlike any other in Russian history. The palace, once warmed by Anastasia's presence, became an echoing tomb of silence and tension. Ivan isolated himself, wandering the halls alone, speaking little, sleeping even less. His eyes, once softened by love, hardened like iron. The gentle calm that Anastasia had nurtured in him for years vanished almost overnight, replaced by a sharp, simmering anger that grew stronger with each passing day. Servants who passed him in the halls described him as a man transformed. He muttered to himself, questioned people without warning, and sometimes burst into fits of rage with no clear trigger. The boyars, already wary of the Tsar's temper, became terrified. They watched as Ivan's grief morphed into a relentless desire for answers and retribution. He interrogated nobles he had once trusted. He accused entire families of conspiring against him. And though actual evidence was scarce, he filled the gaps with memories of betrayals from his youth, convinced that the same forces that had once tormented him were at work again. But the most heartbreaking part of Ivan's descent was the way he spoke of Anastasia. In private moments, he would call her name as if she still lingered just beyond reach. He kept her belongings exactly as they were, her dresses folded neatly, her jewelry untouched, her prayer books left open on the pages she last read. These tender gestures, remnants of a love too deep to discard, contrasted sharply with the growing fury that now defined his waking moments. Her absence was not just emotional, it became political, spiritual, and psychological, removing the last barrier between Ivan and the darkness waiting inside him. With Anastasia gone, the Tsar lost not only his closest companion but also his moral anchor. She had been the voice that soothed him, the presence that guided him toward reason, the influence that nudged him toward compassion. Without her, he felt unmoored, drifting into a sea of uncertainty and fear. And fear, for Ivan, always transformed into aggression. He began to suspect that enemies surrounded him, hiding behind polite smiles and bowed heads. The court, sensing the dangerous shift, became a place of whispered conversations and nervous glances. It was during this period of grief-driven paranoia that the foundations for Ivan's future tyranny began to solidify. He no longer trusted the noble families who had once held power. He no longer believed loyalty was genuine. Instead, he started forming the idea that he needed a new kind of protector, a group that would answer only to him, obey without question, and punish without hesitation. The conception of the Oprichnina, his personal force of black-clad enforcers, was not the product of logical strategy but of emotional desperation. Outside the palace walls, the people of Russia mourned alongside their ruler. Anastasia had been beloved by many, admired for her piety, gentleness, and genuine care for the poor. But while common folk grieved quietly, they had no idea what her death meant for the future of their country. They saw a Tsar heartbroken, a man in pain. They could not see the deeper transformation brewing beneath the surface, nor could they foresee how the shadows gathering in Ivan's heart would one day sweep across the entire nation. For weeks, Ivan remained withdrawn, consumed by grief and suspicion. His advisors attempted to reach him, but their efforts only fueled his doubts. Anyone who urged patience became an enemy. Anyone who suggested moving forward became a suspect. His pain had become a lens through which he viewed the world, distorting every gesture, every word, every silence into a potential threat. Even moments of stillness triggered memories of loss, his mother, his father, his childhood, and now, the only person who had ever brought him genuine peace. Eventually, the quiet grieving turned into something else entirely. Grief, left unchecked and fed by fear, hardened into anger. And anger, for Ivan, rarely stayed contained. His sorrow gave rise to decisions and actions that would forever alter Russia's history. The Tsar who had once dreamed of unity and reform now believed that only absolute control could protect him from the world that had taken everything he loved. The death of Anastasia did not simply wound Ivan, it changed him. It shattered the fragile balance that had kept his darker impulses at bay. In losing her, he lost the last fragment of innocence he had held on to. And in the void her absence left behind, a harsher version of the Tsar took shape, one fueled by fear, grief, and the belief that betrayal lurked in every corner. From this point on, Ivan's rule would never be the same. The love that once softened him was gone, and in its place grew a determination to rule through fear, to eliminate enemies real or imagined, and to trust no one ever again. The gentle warmth Anastasia had brought into his life faded into cold memory, and the man left standing in her shadow was no longer the hopeful young ruler she had known but a grieving, suspicious sovereign who believed that only ruthless strength could protect what remained of his fragile world. The creation of the Oprichnina did not begin with a grand proclamation or a neatly crafted plan. It began with fear, raw, deep, unrelenting fear that settled into Ivan's bones after Anastasia's death. It began with sleepless nights where he paced the palace halls like a restless shadow, convinced unseen enemies lurked behind every door. It began with the echo of grief in his chest twisting into something sharp and dangerous. By the time Ivan took his first step toward forming the Oprichniki, the transformation inside him was already complete. The Tsar who once sought unity now sought security. And in his mind, security could only come through terror. The boyars had always been a source of suspicion, but in these dark days, Ivan saw betrayal in every gesture, threat in every whisper. No amount of reassurance could shake the feeling that someone among them had murdered Anastasia. The court's silence, once a sign of respect, now felt like a conspiracy. Unable to trust the nobles, Ivan concluded that he needed a new force, one that answered only to him, one that would act without hesitation, one that could tear apart the noble families he believed had schemed against him for years. This force would become known as the Oprichniki. The idea, simple at first, grew into a sweeping vision. Ivan divided Russia into two realms, the Zemshchina, ruled by traditional nobles, and the Oprichnina, a separate state under Ivan's direct control. In this second realm, Ivan wielded absolute power, unhindered by boyar influence. The Oprichniki were his chosen enforcers, his guards, his executioners, his loyal shadows. They were to be everything the boyars were not, obedient, disciplined, unquestioning. The men Ivan selected for this elite force were not noble-born. Many came from lower classes, men who had little to lose and everything to gain by serving the Tsar. They had no ties to boyar families, no secret loyalties, no hidden agendas. Their devotion belonged solely to Ivan, and that devotion was built on a mixture of fear, privilege, and fanaticism. To be chosen as an oprichnik was to be lifted out of obscurity and given the power to judge, to punish, and to act with the authority of the Tsar himself. The oprichniki dressed in long, black robes, robes that seemed to absorb the faintest light. They rode horses draped in black, and on their saddles they carried two chilling symbols, a broom and a severed dog's head, one to sweep away treason, the other to sniff out enemies. These macabre emblems announced their presence long before they arrived, making villagers turn pale and nobles tremble behind locked doors. Even the sight of their horses approaching through the morning mist became enough to silence entire towns. Their duties were not merely military. They were investigators, informants, executioners. They rooted out alleged traitors with ruthless precision. They raided noble estates, seized property, punished disobedience, and executed those deemed threats to the Tsar. Sometimes they acted on Ivan's direct orders, other times they followed their own suspicions, interpreting the Tsar's wishes through the lens of fear and fanatic loyalty. Those who joined them felt the intoxicating blend of power and terror. Those who opposed them rarely lived long enough to regret it. Ivan's court began to change as well. The Tsar surrounded himself with oprichniki even in his most private moments. Their black-cloaked silhouettes guarded his chambers, accompanied him on hunts, and followed him during state processions. Their presence created a constant, palpable tension. Courtiers knew that a single wrong word, a poorly chosen gesture, or even a misunderstood silence could be enough to draw the attention of these feared enforcers. And while the Oprichniki grew in power, Ivan's own appearance began to shift. He shaved his head like a monk yet wielded his authority like a wrathful king. Some nights he gathered the Oprichniki for dark banquets where they feasted, drank heavily, joked crudely, and discussed the fates of nobles with chilling casualness. Their laughter, boisterous, sharp, and edged with violence, echoed through the palace corridors long after the festivities ended. Outside the court, the people of Russia watched the rise of the Oprichnina with a mixture of confusion and dread. Peasants whispered stories of black-robed riders emerging from forests like phantoms, their horses moving silently through fog-choked roads. Merchants cursed the unpredictability of these raids, never knowing when goods, money, or even life would be confiscated in the name of the Tsar. Entire towns learned to fall silent at the sight of the Oprichniki's banners, lowering their eyes and stepping aside with trembling hands. Yet it wasn't just fear that kept the Oprichniki in power, it was the narrative Ivan crafted around them. He portrayed them as defenders of purity, protectors of the Tsar, a sacred brotherhood fighting against treachery. In his mind, and in the minds of those who followed him, they were not instruments of cruelty but necessary keepers of order. He convinced himself that their brutality was justified, even righteous. Betrayal, he believed, could only be crushed through unwavering force. The more Ivan relied on the Oprichniki, the deeper he drifted into suspicion. Every rumor of dissent fueled his paranoia. Every whisper became evidence of conspiracy. Every noble family became a potential enemy. The Oprichniki acted swiftly, feeding off Ivan's fears, executing his vision of absolute control with terrifying enthusiasm. Villages were burned, estates confiscated, and thousands of families uprooted without warning. Innocent or guilty, it didn't matter. What mattered was loyalty to the Tsar. The Oprichniki also served another, quieter purpose: they filled the void left by Anastasia's death. They became the companions Ivan could command, the loyal presence he felt he needed to survive. Their unquestioning obedience soothed his insecurities. Their power reflected his own. Together, they formed a fortress of brutality around a heart still grieving, still searching for safety in the aftermath of overwhelming loss. But while Ivan believed the Oprichniki made him stronger, they also made him more isolated. The court no longer dared to speak honestly to him. The military resented the privileges granted to a force that operated above the law. The common people grew weary of living under a constant shadow of fear. And the boyars, though shattered and scattered, simmered with hatred and helplessness. The Oprichnina had begun as a personal shield, but it was quickly becoming something larger, an empire within an empire, driven not by justice but by Ivan's darkest instincts. As the years passed, the Oprichniki's power would expand, their actions would become more violent, and Ivan's grip on reality would grow ever more fragile. The creation of this black-clad brotherhood marked one of the most pivotal shifts in Russian history. It was the moment when the Tsar stopped trying to rule through order and began ruling through fear. It was the moment he stopped trusting the structures of governance and instead built a world that existed solely on his terms. And while many believed the Oprichniki were protecting the Tsar, the truth was far more tragic: they were protecting the darkness that had taken root inside him. As their influence grew, so too did the storm that would soon sweep across Russia, leaving scars the land would carry for generations. Ivan's transformation from a reforming young Tsar into a ruthless, unpredictable sovereign became starkly visible through the rise of the Oprichniki. But the true evolution, the shift that turned him into something resembling a gangster boss of his own empire, unfolded gradually, through countless decisions shaped by fear, rage, and a hunger for absolute control. To understand this phase of his life, one must step into the chilling atmosphere of his court, where the lines between monarchy and criminal syndicate blurred until they became nearly indistinguishable. What emerged in these years was a system that resembled the underworld organizations of future centuries more than the traditional courts of European kings. Ivan ruled not only as a monarch but as the undisputed leader of a shadow empire, one bound together by loyalty, intimidation, and the constant presence of violence. His authority did not flow from noble bloodlines or political negotiations, it flowed from fear, enforced ruthlessly by the black-clad figures who surrounded him day and night. Inside the Kremlin, the palace began to reflect this shift. Courtiers walked with lowered eyes, speaking softly, never knowing who might be listening. Even minor slips of the tongue could be interpreted as disloyalty. The Oprichniki were everywhere, drifting through hallways like silent sentinels, their presence a constant reminder that the Tsar's reach extended into every corner of the realm. If the boyars had once treated Ivan as a pawn, now they saw him as something far more dangerous, an unpredictable ruler whose moods could shift like sudden winds and whose punishments were swift and merciless. Ivan himself embraced this aura of fear. He understood that intimidation granted him a power beyond law or tradition. When he entered a room, he did so with the confidence of someone who knew every person present feared him more than death. His voice carried weight not because of reason or respect, but because it came backed by the silent threat of the Oprichniki's blades. Many rulers commanded armies, but Ivan commanded terror itself, and in these years, terror became his most reliable weapon. His leadership style mirrored that of a crime boss, tight circles of trusted men, secret councils in dimly lit rooms, sudden purges to eliminate potential rivals. Decisions were made not through open debate but behind closed doors, where loyalty was measured by obedience rather than wisdom. Ivan rewarded those who showed absolute devotion and punished even the faintest hint of betrayal. In this world, survival depended on guessing the Tsar's thoughts, anticipating his fears, and proving unwavering allegiance before he ever asked for it. The Oprichniki became Ivan's inner circle, his enforcers, his confidants, his instruments of retribution. They operated like a criminal fraternity, bound by rituals, symbols, and the unspoken agreement that the Tsar's word was absolute. Their black robes and grotesque emblems served as uniforms of intimidation, much like modern gangsters displaying their allegiance through colors or insignia. Their banquets, filled with excess and strange performances, echoed the celebratory indulgence often found in organized crime groups, the kind of gatherings where loyalty was affirmed through revelry and fear mixed with admiration. Ivan led these men with the charisma of a seasoned gang boss. He could be charming, humorous, even affectionate during feasts, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie. But beneath the veneer of fellowship lay a constant tension. Everyone knew that the same Tsar who laughed with them today might condemn them tomorrow. This duality kept his followers perpetually off balance, a tactic that strengthened his control by weakening their sense of certainty. His unpredictability became a weapon, one that made loyalty a matter of survival rather than choice. Beyond the palace walls, this gangster-like rule spread throughout Russia. Towns lived under the shadow of the Oprichniki's authority. Peasants, merchants, and even minor nobles learned to recognize the signs of danger, the sudden arrival of black horses, the sound of boots approaching late at night, the eerie quiet that followed raids. Like the victims of a powerful crime syndicate, they understood that compliance was the only path to safety. Resistance, even when justified, often ended in ruin. What made Ivan different from typical gang leaders, however, was the sheer scale of his influence. He wasn't running a criminal network hidden from public view, he was shaping the very structure of the state to mirror his fears and desires. In the same way modern mafia bosses exert control over territories through intimidation, Ivan used the Oprichnina to carve out his own domain within Russia, one where he alone dictated the rules. The legal system, once strengthened by his early reforms, now bent under his demands. Punishment no longer required evidence. Confessions were extracted, not discovered. Justice became whatever Ivan wanted it to be, shifting with his emotions. Over time, the distinction between the Tsar's official government and his shadow government blurred. The Oprichniki acted with more authority than traditional officials. Their word could revoke land, seize wealth, or end lives without warning. Their raids became a method of economic control, stripping boyars of property and redistributing it to loyalists, much like gangsters reclaiming territory from rivals. In this sense, Ivan used terror not only to punish enemies but also to strengthen his economic and political power. Psychologically, the Tsar drifted further into a world shaped entirely by suspicion. Every glance from a noble, every delay in a response, every murmur in a hallway became potential evidence of conspiracy. This mindset fueled increasingly brutal actions. Executions, once rare, became common. Entire families vanished overnight. Villages were destroyed as examples. And through it all, Ivan convinced himself that he was acting in defense of the state, purging treason, cleansing corruption, fulfilling divine duty. But beneath the surface, the truth was more tragic. Ivan had become the ruler he once feared, the powerful, merciless figure who believed violence was the only path to security. His court functioned less like a governing body and more like a gang headquarters, where loyalty was purchased with power and maintained through terror. The Oprichniki, created to protect him, now mirrored his darkest instincts, acting out his paranoia with feverish devotion. This period of Ivan's rule marked the point where the Tsar's legitimacy intertwined with his capacity for fear. He no longer trusted traditional systems or the people within them. Instead, he held power. Through the same methods that defined the underworld, intimidation, secrecy, brutality, and unwavering dominance. And while he believed he was defending Russia from invisible threats, he was in fact reshaping it into an empire ruled by shadow more than law. Yet even in this darkness, a part of Ivan believed sincerely in his mission. He saw threats everywhere because the ghosts of his past whispered to him constantly. He believed that without absolute control, everything would crumble. And in this belief, he justified every harsh decision, every execution, every act of terror. The Tsar who once dreamed of order and reform had become the architect of a system where fear ruled more effectively than loyalty ever could. The rise of the gangster-like Tsar was not simply a political strategy. It was the evolution of a wounded soul, one who had lost his guiding light and now sought security in shadows. And as his power grew, so too did the darkness that enveloped him, setting the stage for the tragedies and horrors that would soon sweep across the land. The winter mist hung thick over Novgorod like a shroud, muffling sound and dimming the sunlight until everything seemed suspended between waking and nightmare. The bells that once rang proudly from the cathedral towers sat silent in the cold air, their frozen metal still as stone. And the people, merchants, priests, mothers holding frightened children, waited with breath held tight in their chests, knowing that something terrible was coming but powerless to stop it. They had heard the stories from distant towns, black-clad riders, horses draped in darkness, punishments carried out in the Tsar's name. But rumors, no matter how chilling, had not prepared them for the reality approaching their gates. For Ivan, Novgorod represented more than rebellion. It symbolized betrayal, one of the deepest wounds his fragile trust could suffer. Whether the accusations were true or not mattered little to him, suspicion alone was enough to ignite fury. He believed the city had secretly plotted with foreign enemies, and once that idea took hold, it became immovable, fixed in his mind like a blade lodged in bone. The ghost of Anastasia's death still whispered accusations in his ears, feeding the paranoia that had taken root. And so, fueled by grief and righteous conviction, he prepared an example so devastating that no region would dare defy him again. The journey to Novgorod unfolded with a slow, dreadful inevitability. Ivan's forces marched through the snow-covered countryside, accompanied by the Oprichniki, his black-clad brotherhood whose presence alone struck fear into hearts. Their horses' hooves drummed a steady rhythm against the frozen ground, a grim heartbeat carried by the wind. Villagers along the route watched in trembling silence as the army passed, too afraid even to bow. By the time Ivan reached Novgorod, the city was paralyzed by dread. When the Tsar entered the gates, he did so with an unsettling calm. His expression gave away nothing, no rage, no sadness, no hesitation. Instead, he walked through the streets with the steady pace of someone inspecting a crime scene. Each church, each merchant stall, each home seemed to fuel his certainty that treason lurked beneath the surface. The people eyed him from behind shuttered windows, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers, hoping he would change his mind. But Ivan had already made his decision. Novgorod, in his view, needed to be punished. The first arrests came at dawn. Priests accused of conspiring with foreign powers were dragged from their chambers. Nobles were taken from their homes in chains. Merchants found their warehouses seized and turned inside out by oprichniki searching for evidence of treachery. Families watched helplessly as sons were taken from beds, fathers torn from meals, wives held back by silent guards as their loved ones disappeared into makeshift prison camps. The freezing air echoed with muffled cries, small, fragile sounds swallowed quickly by the vastness of the river and the enormity of what was unfolding. Ivan did not lash out in sudden bursts of anger. His actions were deliberate, methodical, executed with an eerie precision that made them all the more terrifying. The oprichniki followed the Tsar's example. They rode through the streets in tightly organized formations, their black garments billowing like dark flags. Their symbols, the broom and the severed dog's head, appeared on banners hung across the city, reminders of their mission, to sweep away treason and sniff out disloyalty. To the people of Novgorod, these symbols were not warnings, they were sentences. Certain accounts describe Ivan walking through the city with a kind of grim ritual, visiting monasteries and cathedrals, demanding confessions, questioning monks with unnerving intensity. The Tsar who once knelt in prayer beside Anastasia now moved through holy places with the weight of judgment in his every step. His spiritual turmoil mixed with political paranoia until each fed the other. Where he sought signs of loyalty, he saw betrayal, where he sought truth, he found threats. The river, frozen in early winter, became another stage for the unfolding tragedy. It was said that ice groaned beneath the weight of countless prisoners forced into its frigid depths. Some were accused of treason, others were collateral victims of the oprichniki growing zeal. Witnesses later recalled how the water swallowed the screaming and then fell silent once more, the current carrying away the last traces beneath a sheet of glass like ice. The sight left even hardened soldiers shaken, but none dared speak out, not when Ivan himself watched with cold, unreadable eyes. Yet amid the terror, there were quiet, heartbreaking moments. Mothers standing in doorways, begging silently for mercy. Children clutching each other inside darkened rooms while the sounds of boots echoed outside. Priests offering final blessings to those dragged away, their trembling voices mingling with the wind. The tragedy of Novgorod was not only in its scale but in the intimate human suffering woven through its every hour. As the days stretched into weeks, the city's spirit began to crumble. Markets once filled with chatter fell silent. Churches burned incense in mourning. Streets that had been bustling with life now lay deserted, touched only by snow and the shadows of passing oprichniki. Ivan, relentless in his resolve, continued his campaign with merciless efficiency. He believed he was purging his nation of treason, restoring purity, defending Russia's destiny. But in truth, he was carving deeper wounds into the heart of his own people. When Ivan finally departed, Novgorod was a shell of what it had been. The bells remained silent. Thousands had perished. Countless families had been uprooted. Homes once filled with warmth now stood empty, their doors swinging open in the winter wind. The river, which had witnessed so much suffering, flowed on as if unaware of the lives taken beneath its surface. But the greatest tragedy of the sack of Novgorod was not the destruction alone, it was the irreversible change it revealed in Ivan. The Tsar who had once dreamed of building a strong, unified Russia had become a ruler dominated by fear and driven by the conviction that terror was his only weapon. His actions had crossed a threshold from suspicion into full-fledged tyranny. The whispers that followed him back to Moscow were different now, they did not question his authority, they feared it. The city of Novgorod would rebuild in time, but the scars, emotional, spiritual, generational, would remain etched into the land and the people's memories. And for Ivan, this event marked another turning point in his transformation. The darkness inside him, once kept at bay by love and hope, now held full dominion. What happened next in his reign would only deepen the shadows he cast across Russia. But for now, the quiet aftermath of Novgorod's devastation lay heavy across the land, a chilling reminder of what a ruler consumed by grief and paranoia could unleash. The years following the tragedy at Novgorod brought no calm to Ivan's troubled soul. If anything, the devastation he unleashed there hardened his belief that Russia could survive only under his absolute control. And so, as winter thawed and the rivers began to move again, Ivan's gaze drifted outward, toward the horizon, toward foreign borders, toward the dream that had lived in his mind since youth. He wanted Russia to expand, to break free from the constraints of limited trade routes and vulnerable defenses. He wanted access to the Baltic Sea, a gateway to wealth, commerce, diplomacy, and recognition from Western Europe. But most of all, Ivan wanted power that reached beyond fear at home. He wanted influence abroad. This ambition set the stage for the long and grueling conflict known as the Livonian War, a war that began with promise but slowly unraveled into one of the most draining and consequential struggles of Ivan's reign. It was a war that tested the limits of his strategies, strained his resources, and magnified every instability already simmering within Russia. To understand this chapter of Ivan's life is to witness not a single dramatic moment, but a slow and complicated struggle that revealed the widening cracks in the empire he tried so fiercely to control. When Ivan first set his sights on the Livonian territories, his motivations were both practical and symbolic. The Livonian order controlled valuable ports on the Baltic Sea, ports that would give Russia direct access to European trade. For centuries, Russia had been isolated from Western commerce, forced to rely on indirect and often unreliable channels for goods, alliances, and technological innovation. To secure a port of his own meant breaking the bottleneck that had kept Russia inland, locked away from the flourishing markets of Europe. Ivan saw this not just as a strategic necessity but as a deeply personal mission. It aligned with his long-held vision of Russia as a powerful empire, one that deserved the same respect as the great kingdoms of Europe. Control of the Baltic would elevate Russia's standing, strengthen its economy, and silence those who believed the nation was too backward, too fragmented, or too unrefined to compete on the global stage. With this determination, Ivan launched his campaign in 1558. At first, the Russian forces made sweeping gains. The Livonian order, weakened by internal decline, was unprepared for the ferocity of the assault. Russian troops advanced rapidly, capturing forts, towns, and strategic points. Confidence ran high. Chronicles from the period describe messengers arriving in Moscow with news of victory after victory, each one greeted with celebration. Ivan believed the war would be swift, a decisive strike that would secure Russia's place at the Baltic with minimal resistance. But the Livonian War did not remain a simple conflict for long. Success attracted attention, and soon powerful neighbors stepped into the battlefield. Sweden, Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark each saw an opportunity to claim territory or prevent Russia from rising too quickly. What began as a local campaign spiraled into a complex, multi-front struggle with some of the strongest military forces in Northern Europe. Ivan, who was accustomed to ruling with fear at home, now found himself challenged by foreign powers that neither feared his methods nor bowed to his authority. The shifting alliances created a landscape that was difficult to navigate. Sweden, led by capable military leaders, began pushing back against Russian advances. Poland-Lithuania, under King Stephen Bathory, emerged as an especially formidable opponent. Their combined pressure forced Russia into a defensive stance, stretching Ivan's resources thin and exhausting his troops. The Oprichnina, which consumed massive funding and caused widespread internal instability, weakened Russia's ability to sustain long-term conflict. War and internal terror became burdens pulling in opposite directions, threatening to tear the country apart. Within Russia, the consequences of the war rippled through villages, towns, and cities. Supplies dwindled, taxes soared, and families watched sons march off to battle with uncertain futures. The once energetic spirit that had carried the nation into the war began to fade, replaced by fatigue and worry. Merchants struggled with disrupted trade, farmers faced harsh harvest seasons, and communities braced themselves for foreign raids or sudden Oprichniki inspections. The war abroad and the terror at home created a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Ivan, increasingly paranoid and embittered, responded not with strategic flexibility but with stubborn insistence that victory was inevitable. He pressured his generals, demanded additional resources, and punished those he suspected of disloyalty or incompetence. The clarity and ambition that had marked his early reforms were now overshadowed by suspicion and emotional volatility. He refused to see the larger picture, that the war was draining his nation and empowering his rivals. In his eyes, war was no longer merely about territory, it was about pride, revenge, and proving that no one, foreign or domestic, could challenge him. Diplomacy, which might have offered a way out, became increasingly difficult. Ivan's unpredictable behavior and reputation for cruelty made negotiations tense and fragile. Foreign leaders viewed him with caution, unsure whether he would uphold agreements or lash out unexpectedly. Even when he attempted peace talks, his demands were often unreasonable, fueled more by emotion than practicality. Russia found itself isolated on the international stage, struggling to secure strong alliances. And yet, through all the conflict, Ivan never lost sight of what he hoped to achieve. He continued to envision Russia as a great maritime power. He persisted in sending envoys to Western courts, seeking trade relationships, technological exchanges, and political recognition. For all his brutality, Ivan had a profound understanding that Russia needed to expand its horizons. But his methods, rooted in fear, suspicion, and uncompromising aggression, often sabotaged his own objectives. The Livonian War dragged on for over 2 decades, reshaping the landscape of Eastern Europe. Battles were fought on snow-covered fields, in dense forests, and along riverbanks frozen solid in winter. Soldiers trudged through mud and frost. Cities were besieged, captured, lost, and retaken. The conflict became a grim cycle of advance and retreat, victory and loss, hope and disappointment. By the time Russia finally withdrew and the war ended, the costs were staggering. Ivan had gained no lasting foothold on the Baltic. The dream he had pursued for so long slipped through his fingers like melting ice. But the war did more than drain resources, it deepened the fissures within Ivan's psyche. Each setback reinforced his belief that enemies surrounded him. Each loss intensified his temper. Each betrayal, real or imagined, pushed him further into isolation. The Livonian War did not merely weaken Russia, it weakened its ruler, accelerating his descent into suspicion and tyranny. By the end of this chapter, Ivan was not the same man who had launched the war decades earlier with such determination. The confident young Tsar who once envisioned a Russia rising boldly onto the European stage had faded into a ruler haunted by ghosts, worn by conflict, and shaped more by fear than vision. The Livonian War had begun as a quest for opportunity, but it ended as a testament to the unsustainable weight of Ivan's ambition. It left behind questions that lingered in the minds of his people: how much more could Russia endure? What price would the Tsar demand next? And would the darkness swelling inside him ever find an end? As Ivan returned to Moscow, weary and hardened, the storm clouds above his reign continued to gather. What awaited the nation now would test its spirit in ways even the war had not prepared it for. The final years of the Livonian War left Ivan exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly distrustful of everyone around him. The battlefield had drained Russia's treasury and shattered countless families, but it had also reshaped Ivan's perception of the world. Where once he saw obstacles, he now saw enemies. Where once he doubted the boyars, he now doubted entire nations. And where once he feared betrayal, he now expected it. The war had not only reshaped borders, it had reshaped Ivan's mind. As the conflict dragged on, Russia found itself surrounded by powerful foes: Poland-Lithuania to the west, Sweden to the north, and the remnants of the Livonian order still clinging to survival. These were not small regional rivals. They were strong, organized states with experienced rulers, disciplined armies, and clear strategies. Facing them required careful diplomacy and long-term planning, qualities Ivan had possessed in his youth but struggled to maintain now under the weight of paranoia and loss. The first signs of trouble came when Sweden strengthened its presence in the Baltic region. Commanders like Pontus de la Gardie led campaigns that struck Russian positions with surprising agility. Swedish forces were well equipped and well trained, and their strategic approach differed from Ivan's often emotional decision-making. Each Swedish victory felt, to Ivan, like a personal attack rather than a military setback. He began to see their advances not as the natural result of a difficult war, but as evidence of coordinated plots against him. Poland-Lithuania posed an even greater threat. Its ruler, Stephen Bathory, was not only a skilled commander but also an intelligent strategist capable of uniting diverse forces under his banner. His campaigns were swift and effective, pushing deep into Russian territories. Cities that had been secure for decades found themselves suddenly vulnerable. Ivan's armies, already battered and stretched thin, struggled to push back. These defeats struck at the heart of Ivan's pride. For a ruler who believed deeply in divine favor, such losses felt like betrayal by heaven itself. But what troubled Ivan most were not the battles, they were the whispers. The idea that traitors in Russia were aiding foreign invaders became an obsession. And in this obsession, he saw betrayal everywhere, in noble families whose ancestors had once opposed his rise, in advisors who hesitated to support his most extreme decisions, and in towns that refused to supply enough men or provisions for the war. Every perceived failure became another piece of evidence that the world was turning against him. Internal dissent grew as the war dragged on. Russia's people were exhausted. Years of conflict, high taxes, and the Oprichnina's terror had taken their toll. Villagers feared foreign armies as much as they feared Ivan's black-clad enforcers. Merchants suffered from disrupted trade routes. Local leaders found themselves torn between loyalty to the Tsar and the survival of their communities. Even among Ivan's closest allies, whispers spread that the war was unwinnable, that the nation needed peace before it collapsed entirely. Ivan reacted to these murmurs with rage. He believed that weakness at home emboldened enemies abroad. In his mind, the Livonian War had become a test, not just of military might but of loyalty. And so he began demanding more from his people, more soldiers, more supplies, more sacrifices. When towns hesitated, he accused them of treason. When nobles expressed concern, he questioned their allegiance. When generals lost battles, he suspected sabotage. The paranoia that had driven the creation of the Oprichniki now surged through Ivan with renewed intensity. Every military setback felt like proof of internal betrayal. Every delay felt like disobedience. Every disagreement felt like conspiracy. Foreign diplomats who once negotiated cautiously with Ivan now approached him with increasing difficulty. His reputation for cruelty and instability made alliances fragile. Ambassadors reported his unpredictable behavior, sudden mood swings, harsh accusations, and emotional outbursts. Some described meetings where the Tsar ranted about enemies conspiring in secret rooms, invisible forces seeking to destroy Russia, and spies hiding even in his own household. Yet for all the instability he created, Ivan remained an intelligent observer of world politics. He knew Poland-Lithuania and Sweden were dangerous foes. He understood that Western Europe viewed Russia with suspicion. He recognized that his own nation was struggling beneath the weight of war. But instead of responding with measured diplomacy or strategic adjustment, he responded with force. Where caution was needed, he pushed harder. Where negotiation might have succeeded, he made demands. Where compromise could have brought relief, he saw only surrender. This emotional rigidity, shaped by his childhood trauma and magnified by Anastasia's loss, turned every foreign challenge into a personal battle. Ivan couldn't see Poland-Lithuania as a rival empire, he saw it as a direct attacker of his authority. He couldn't see Sweden as a strategic competitor, he saw it as a mocking adversary trying to undermine his rule. And he couldn't see his own generals as human beings exhausted by years of conflict, he saw them as potential traitors who might one day abandon him. Inside the Kremlin, trust deteriorated quickly. Ministers argued quietly behind closed doors, unsure how to guide their ruler without provoking his wrath. Different factions formed, some trying to moderate Ivan's impulses, others encouraging his suspicion for their own gain. Even within the Oprichnina, loyalties began to fray. Men who once acted without hesitation now hesitated to interpret Ivan's commands. The line between caution and rebellion blurred dangerously. Meanwhile, Russia's borders continued to buckle. Foreign armies captured fortresses Ivan had once considered secure. Raids struck villages deep within Russian territory. Supply lines faltered. The war's financial burden grew heavier with each campaign. And with every setback, Ivan's fury grew. This period in Ivan's reign became a tangled web of external threats and internal fractures, each one feeding the other. Foreign pressure intensified Ivan's paranoia. His paranoia weakened Russia's ability to respond to foreign pressure. It was a self-destructive cycle, one that pushed the Tsar further into isolation and pushed his nation closer to breaking. Yet even as the world around him destabilized, Ivan still held on to the idea that he alone could save Russia. He believed that only he understood the danger. Only he recognized the treachery. Only he could guide the nation through darkness. It was this belief, rooted in equal parts genius and delusion, that allowed him to justify every harsh decision he made. Enemies were everywhere now, on the battlefield, in the council chambers, in the noble families, in the streets of Moscow, even in the innocence of silence. The Tsar who once dreamed of expansion now fought desperately to maintain control of the empire he had nearly torn apart with his own hands. And as war and paranoia tightened their grip on Ivan, the cracks in his family began to widen, leading to one of the most tragic moments of his entire reign. The tragedy that unfolded between Ivan and his eldest son is one of the most heartbreaking and haunting moments in Russian history, a moment that reveals the full weight of the Tsar's emotional unraveling, the deep scars of his past, and the devastating consequences of a life ruled by suspicion and fear. It is a story told in whispers, painted in anguished brushstrokes, and remembered with a sorrow that echoes through centuries. And yet, this tragic event did not happen suddenly. It simmered quietly for years, building tension piece by piece until the fragile bond between father and son finally shattered. To understand how Ivan came to strike the blow that killed his heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, one must first understand the relationship they shared. The Tsarevich was not merely the Tsar's child, he was his reflection, his future, the living embodiment of the Russia Ivan hoped to build. Bright, intelligent, disciplined, the young Ivan possessed many of the qualities his father admired. He was strong-willed but thoughtful, firm but fair, ambitious but grounded. In many ways, he was the kind of ruler Ivan once dreamed of becoming before trauma reshaped his life. There were moments when the Tsar looked upon his son and saw not just an heir, but a promise, a hope for a Russia that might one day rise above the chaos and fear that had shaped his own reign. But the father and son were also divided by the shadows swirling around Ivan's court. The Tsarevich, witnessing the suffering caused by the Oprichnina and the endless wars, grew increasingly bold in questioning his father's decisions. He criticized the harshness of the purges, the strain placed upon the people, and the direction of Russia's foreign policies. His words, though respectful, struck at the heart of Ivan's greatest fear, that those closest to him doubted his judgment. The Tsar's pride, already fragile and worn thin by years of paranoia, began to fracture under the pressure of a son who dared to speak truths Ivan did not want to face. Their disagreements grew more frequent as Russia suffered through prolonged conflict. The Tsarevich, desperate to defend his homeland, pleaded for reinforcements to be sent to the front lines. He demanded stronger military support, more supplies, more soldiers, anything to keep Russian forces from collapsing under the pressure of Poland, Lithuania and Sweden. But Ivan, consumed by suspicion and racked by emotional turmoil, often refused or delayed decisions. Each plea from his son felt like an accusation, a reminder of failures he could not accept. The tension between them deepened further when Ivan's daughter-in-law became pregnant. The Tsarevich cherished his wife and hoped the child she carried would secure the future of the dynasty. But one day, when Ivan visited their chambers, he found her dressed in a way he considered inappropriate for a woman expecting a royal heir. Accounts differ on what angered him, whether it was her clothing, her posture, or simply the mood he brought with him into the room, but whatever the reason, Ivan's temper surged without warning. In a moment of rage, he struck her. The blow was severe, and the young woman, frightened and injured, collapsed. She soon suffered a miscarriage. When the Tsarevich learned what had happened, the world seemed to freeze around him. He rushed to her side, devastated, then stormed through the palace in search of his father. He found Ivan pacing in anger, but the sight of his son's grief hit him like a sudden wave. The Tsarevich confronted him, his voice trembling between fury and heartbreak. He condemned the attack, demanded answers, demanded remorse. For the first time, he spoke to his father not as a subordinate, not as an heir, but as a man defending the honor of his family and the life of his unborn child. Ivan, already on edge from the war, the pressure of ruling, and the ghosts whispering in his mind, heard the confrontation not as a plea but as a threat. In his fragile emotional state, he perceived his son's anger as rebellion, a challenge to his authority. Words escalated rapidly, sharp and heated. The Tsarevich accused his father of cruelty and negligence. Ivan accused his son of disobedience and treachery. Each sentence threw fuel onto a fire neither man intended to ignite. And then, in a moment that history struggles to comprehend, it happened. Ivan, trembling with anger, grabbed his staff, or perhaps a scepter, or perhaps simply struck with his hand. Accounts vary, but what remained consistent in every retelling is the sound. A sharp crack. A gasp. A sudden silence. The Tsarevich staggered backward, clutching his head. Shock washed over his face as he collapsed into his father's arms. In an instant, the anger drained from Ivan's body, replaced by terror. He fell to his knees, cradling his son, desperately calling his name. Servants rushed into the room, but none dared move the Tsar. Ivan wept openly, loud, broken sobs that echoed through the chamber. He pressed trembling hands against the wound, begging God to spare his son, begging forgiveness for an act he had never intended to commit. But the injury was too severe. Over the next days, the Tsarevich's condition worsened. He drifted in and out of consciousness, calling weakly for his father, his wife, and the child he would never meet. Ivan rarely left his side. He held his son's hand, stroked his hair, prayed endlessly. The Tsar who had shown so little mercy to others now found himself crushed beneath the weight of a grief unlike any he had known. This was not an enemy he could punish. This was not a threat he could eliminate. This was his son, his heir, his future, slipping away because of a moment of uncontrollable rage. When the Tsarevich finally died, the palace fell into a hush so deep it felt like the air itself stopped moving. Ivan collapsed beside the bed, his face buried in his son's chest. Those who stood outside the chamber reported hearing his cries long into the night, a haunting melody of regret, despair, and self-loathing. The Tsar, feared across all Russia, was reduced to a grieving father, broken by his own hand. In the days that followed, Ivan withdrew further into darkness. The guilt of killing his son never left him. It haunted his dreams. It followed him through palace corridors. It echoed in every decision he made. He had feared betrayal his entire life, yet in the end, it was he who betrayed the person he loved most. This tragedy deepened his paranoia, sharpened his cruelty, and solidified his belief that suffering was inevitable for a ruler chosen by fate. The death of the Tsarevich was not merely a personal loss, it was a national catastrophe. Russia lost a capable heir, a promising leader, a future Tsar whose wisdom and strength might have guided the nation toward stability. Instead, the dynasty's succession grew uncertain. The nation trembled. And Ivan, already unsteady, spiraled further into emotional and psychological collapse. It was a moment that revealed the full tragedy of Ivan's life, a ruler shaped by fear, driven by passion, undone by his own wounds. And though history remembers him for his brutality, this moment, this quiet, devastating moment, shows the human beneath the crown, the father who loved too fiercely and feared too deeply, and the man who, in one instant of rage, destroyed the very thing he cherished most. From here, the shadows over Ivan's reign only grew darker. But the grief he carried from this moment would never leave him. It became the ghost that walked beside him until his final breath. In the years after the death of his beloved son, Ivan drifted into a realm of emotional and spiritual turbulence unlike anything he had experienced before. The world around him became quieter, not because peace had settled over Russia, but because the Tsar himself began withdrawing from it, step by step, breath by breath, retreating into a labyrinth of guilt, visions, and prayers. The palace that once echoed with his commands and the clatter of the oprytniki now felt strangely hollow. Its halls, once filled with the rustle of black robes and the tense energy of political scheming, grew heavy with a silence that seemed to swallow whole the footsteps of anyone who dared walk them. Ivan's grief over the Tsarevich did not erupt in violent fury the way past tragedies had. Instead, it settled deep within him, like a weight pressing on his heart, darkening every thought. For the first time in years, his rage no longer felt powerful, it felt exhausting. He looked at the world through eyes clouded with sorrow, and everything seemed to bear the mark of his own failures. The ruler who once believed himself chosen by God now found himself questioning whether God had turned his face away. In this emotional collapse, Ivan turned toward religion with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He had always been devout, raised among priests, schooled in scripture, fascinated by theology, but now his faith became a refuge, a place to hide from the torment of his own conscience. He spent long hours kneeling in cold, dimly lit chapels, his forehead pressed to the floor. He prayed with a fervor that startled even the clergy. Some nights he remained in church until dawn, whispering psalms under his breath, seeking forgiveness for sins he believed could never be washed away. The Tsar grew increasingly drawn to monks, mystics, and wandering holy men, figures who lived on the fringes of society, untouched by politics or privilege. He invited them into his private chambers, asking them to interpret dreams, to explain omens, to help him understand the suffering that seemed to follow him. Their words, often cryptic or contradictory, fed into his already fragile state of mind. Some claimed his grief was divine punishment, others said it was a test meant to purify his soul. Ivan listened to them all, desperate for meaning. The palace staff noticed troubling changes in his behavior. He stopped attending councils regularly. His meals grew sparse, his sleep irregular. Servants found him wandering alone at night, muttering prayers or lamentations, sometimes pausing in darkened hallways as if listening to voices only he could hear. He often spoke to his dead son as though he were still alive, apologizing, begging forgiveness, or recounting decisions he had made that day, decisions he once would have delivered with authority but now questioned endlessly. His fascination with relics and sacred objects intensified. He ordered messengers to travel the countryside, searching monasteries for ancient icons rumored to possess miraculous properties. He sent gifts to holy shrines, hoping to gain favor or redemption. He commissioned lavish religious artworks while the treasury strained to support the ongoing wars. And though he immersed himself in symbols of faith, peace eluded him. The stillness of prayer sometimes soothed him, but it often left him feeling even more hollow, for no amount of devotion could silence the memory of the moment his staff struck his son. This spiritual turbulence also impacted Ivan's relationship with the clergy. Some church leaders, wary of the Tsar's unpredictable behavior, urged him to seek a gentler path, to embrace mercy and repentance. Others, hoping to maintain influence, encouraged his obsession with divine signs and visions. Ivan oscillated between these voices, at times listening earnestly, at other times lashing out in frustration. His relationship with religion became tangled in contradictions. He sought comfort in its rituals, yet feared its judgments. He embraced the Church's teachings, yet remained haunted by the belief that he had failed in the eyes of God. Meanwhile, the political landscape around him grew increasingly unstable. Without his active guidance, factions within the court gained strength. Some nobles regained influence they had lost during the Oprytnina. Others plotted quietly, testing how far they could push boundaries before Ivan noticed. Foreign diplomats, sensing the Tsar's weakened psychological state, maneuvered more boldly on the international stage. But Ivan, lost in inner turmoil, often seemed unaware of these shifts. His thoughts were consumed by questions of morality, fate, and salvation, questions that tangled themselves so tightly around his mind that he struggled to focus on matters of state. Yet amid this spiritual crisis, Ivan was not entirely dissolved into helplessness. There were moments, brief and scattered, when he found bursts of clarity. In these rare hours, he resumed work on reforms, made efforts to stabilize government functions, and consulted with advisors about military campaigns. Those around him hoped these moments marked the beginning of recovery. But they were fleeting. Like candles struggling against a draft, they flickered for a while before being extinguished by waves of self-doubt and sorrow. His isolation grew deeper as time went on. Even those closest to him approached with caution, unsure which version of the Tsar they might encounter, the grieving father seeking solace in prayer, or the troubled ruler sliding toward despair. He pushed away those who tried to comfort him, convinced that he did not deserve compassion. He distrusted those who remained silent, interpreting their quiet as judgment. The palace, once filled with advisors and soldiers, now felt like a monastery of shadows, somber, restrained, and overwhelmed by the weight of its ruler's anguish. Ivan's retreat into spiritual turmoil did not erase the damage he had done, nor did it halt the political and military crises looming over Russia. But it marked a profound shift in his reign, a shift from outward aggression to inward collapse, from fierce command to aching remorse, from ruling through fear to being ruled by fear of judgment. For all his power, Ivan had become a man broken by grief and haunted by his own conscience. And yet, even in this period of deep reflection and isolation, the world outside did not pause. The nation continued to move, its problems unresolved, its threats growing. Soon, the quiet of Ivan's spiritual retreat would give way to new challenges, moments that would force him back into the world he had tried so desperately to escape. But for now, in this dimly lit chapter of his life, Ivan remained a solitary figure kneeling before the altar, searching for forgiveness in a silence that offered none. The Kremlin in Ivan's later years was no longer the vibrant, bustling center of power it once had been. Where diplomats once hurried through corridors, where councils debated strategy, where soldiers trained and scribes recorded the affairs of the realm, now there lingered an eerie quiet, a silence so complete that even the faint echo of footsteps felt intrusive. The air inside the ancient fortress seemed heavy, thick with unspoken fears and the weight of memories too dark to confront. Every chamber held the residue of suspicion. Every shadow seemed longer, every doorway a threshold into uncertainty. The Tsar's presence hung over the palace like a cold mist, shaping the daily rhythm of court life even when he was nowhere in sight. The Oprichnina had technically been abolished by this time, but its legacy lived on in the hearts of the people and in the structure of the state. The black-clad riders no longer patrolled the streets in great numbers, yet their spirit persisted in the whispers that traveled through the court like invisible threads. Anyone could be listening. Anyone could be watching. Even among the servants, eyes darted nervously from one face to another, unsure whom they could trust. In this environment, speech became measured, movement restrained, and silence the safest companion. For Ivan, this silent atmosphere wasn't a sign of decay but a necessary shield. The Tsar, older now and clouded by grief, had come to believe that constant vigilance was the only protection left to him. He watched everything, every gesture, every hesitation, every fragment of a conversation. People who approached him learned to lower their heads, to answer briefly, to avoid gestures that might seem presumptuous. Even the most loyal advisors measured every word carefully, praying that their tone didn't betray fear or uncertainty. At night, the palace took on an even more haunting quality. Torches flickered along stone hallways, casting jagged shadows that danced like sinister figures. Guards stationed at each doorway remained rigid, their faces expressionless, their hands always hovering near their weapons. Somewhere deeper inside the walls, a door might shut softly, or a muffled whisper might break the quiet, causing hearts to leap in startled panic. The mere sound of Ivan's footsteps, soft but purposeful, sent ripples of tension through the air as courtiers straightened themselves, wondering if they had somehow made a misstep that would cost them everything. It wasn't just those in the palace who felt the suffocating weight of fear. Across Moscow, people lived as though under an invisible spell. Market vendors spoke quietly. Families kept their windows shuttered. Priests chose their sermons carefully, aware that even spiritual words might be misinterpreted by the wrong ears. Citizens who once engaged in lively neighborhood conversations now nodded silently in passing, too wary to speak openly of anything beyond the weather. The machinery of government had adapted itself to Ivan's distrust. Decisions that once relied on open councils now trickled down through a small circle of men who had survived years of purges by mastering the art of telling the Tsar what he wanted to hear. Reports were sanitized, carefully shaped to avoid triggering Ivan's anger. Maps presented during military briefings were simplified so losses did not appear too catastrophic. Even correspondence from foreign rulers was filtered, softened, rewritten entirely if necessary. No one dared present Ivan with harsh truths, for the Tsar's reactions were unpredictable, sometimes a quiet nod, sometimes a sudden outburst that left those nearby trembling. Yet beneath all this fear, Ivan retained moments of disarming clarity. There were times when he moved through the Kremlin thoughtfully, speaking with monks or scholars about theology, astronomy, or the fate of the soul. These brief flashes reminded those closest to him that the Tsar had once been a brilliant, inquisitive ruler. But even these moments carried an undercurrent of melancholy. His face, once stern and commanding, now seemed lined not only by age but by sorrow that clung to him like a second skin. His eyes, once sharp and intimidating, now reflected a perpetual exhaustion, as though the weight of his own past pressed on him with unbearable force. Some nights, Ivan convened small gatherings where music played softly, haunting melodies on stringed instruments that echoed through candlelit rooms. But even during these rare reprieves, the atmosphere remained tense. Musicians hesitated, unsure whether a misplaced note might offend the Tsar. Courtiers sipped their wine slowly, afraid that too much joy, too much laughter, might be interpreted as disrespect. Ivan himself would sit silently, lost in thought, staring into the flickering candlelight as though searching for a memory buried deep within its glow. The people of Moscow felt the tension from afar. Families whispered of disappearances, merchants taken for questioning and never seen again, soldiers accused of disloyalty on the thinnest suspicion, peasants punished for crimes they didn't understand. These stories spread quietly, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. Parents instructed their children to speak softly, to avoid drawing attention, to stay home whenever possible. For many, fear became a form of survival. Inside the Kremlin, the fear manifested in subtler but more profound ways. Ivan kept an eye on every noble family, scrutinizing their movements, monitoring their alliances, questioning their loyalties. He ordered the construction of secret rooms and passageways, convinced that spies crept through the palace walls. Servants who cleaned his chambers were required to undergo strict inspections before and after their work, and Ivan often had them dismissed if he sensed even a trace of hesitation in their demeanor. Religious symbols multiplied throughout the palace, icons lining walls, crosses hung over doorways, relics placed on tables and shelves. Ivan surrounded himself with these artifacts not only as symbols of faith but as protection against unseen forces he believed sought his ruin. His prayers grew more fervent, his rituals more elaborate. Some nights he believed angels guarded him, other nights he was convinced demons circled just out of sight. This era of Ivan's rule, marked not by military campaigns but by spiritual unease and internal decay, revealed a ruler haunted not by enemies but by himself. The silence of the Kremlin was not just a physical quiet, it was an echo of Ivan's inner turmoil, a reminder that the walls around him were closing in. Yet even in this oppressive atmosphere, life continued. The court functioned, the city breathed, the empire endured. But beneath the surface, a fragile tension persisted, like ice on a river swollen with dark currents. Everyone knew that one misstep, one whisper, one rumor, one overlooked suspicion, could send the entire fragile balance crashing down. And the only constant through it all was Ivan's unsettling presence, watching, listening, interpreting every silence as a possible threat. The silent Kremlin had become a world shaped entirely by fear and loneliness, a world where loyalty was fragile, hope was scarce, and the Tsar's shadow stretched longer each passing day. In the midst of Ivan's darkest years, when suspicion ran deeper than loyalty and fear had settled into the bones of the nation, something surprising remained: the impact of his early reforms, the structural changes he had put into motion long before grief and rage overtook him. These reforms, though overshadowed by the terror of the Oprichnina, continued shaping Russia quietly, persistently, like roots growing beneath frozen ground. They were the threads of stability woven through a reign otherwise defined by chaos, and their influence would outlive Ivan himself. To understand this period, one must set aside the image of the raging Tsar for a moment and look at the patient architect beneath, the man who envisioned an empire far more centralized, organized, and enduring than the fractured state he inherited. Even as his personal world grew darker, Ivan's administrative reforms continued working inside the machinery of government, changing how Russia functioned on a fundamental level. One major transformation was the strengthening of centralized power. Ivan's early legal codes, particularly the Sudebnik of 1550, had standardized court procedures, limited the boyars' ability to abuse their power, and placed greater authority directly under the Tsar's control. This shift did not disappear when he became consumed by paranoia. Instead, it continued to shape governance long after his emotional stability faltered. Local courts, land management systems, and tax structures operated more consistently because of these reforms. Though not perfect, they brought a sense of order that Russia had never known under the chaotic feuds of rival noble families. Another lasting legacy was the evolution of Russia's military structure. Before Ivan, armies were often temporary forces assembled during crises. Ivan, however, had taken steps to professionalize military service. The creation of the Streltsy, Russia's first standing firearm-equipped infantry units, marked a turning point. Despite later political turmoil, the Streltsy remained a fixture in Russia's military landscape for generations, influencing warfare, defense, and even political dynamics. They became not just soldiers but a recognized institution, demonstrating Ivan's forward-thinking approach to strengthening the state. Territorially, Ivan had expanded Russia's borders to include vast lands previously controlled by the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. These conquests opened the Volga River to Russian control, providing access to trade routes reaching deep into Asia. Though the Livonian War drained resources and ended without Baltic success, the earlier victories were monumental. They broke the centuries-long dominance of the Tatar-Mongol states and laid the groundwork for Russia's emergence as a multi-ethnic empire. The incorporation of these regions reshaped Russia's identity, broadening its cultural, political, and economic horizons. The administrative reforms connected to the Zemsky Sobor, the National Assembly, also continued to play a role. While Ivan was increasingly suspicious of noble influence, the Sobor nevertheless served as a consultative body representing not just boyars but clergy and townspeople. It introduced the concept, however limited, of broader political participation. Though Ivan's later distrust weakened its influence, the institution did not vanish. Instead, it grew in importance under later rulers, helping to stabilize governance during times of succession crisis and national turmoil. Ivan's focus on church relations also left a long-lasting impact. His religious councils, negotiations with clergy, and efforts to define the church's role in the state created a clearer relationship between spiritual and political authority. Ivan's reign saw the strengthening of Moscow as a religious center, reinforcing the idea that Russia was the protector of Eastern Orthodoxy after the fall of Constantinople. This concept, Moscow as the Third Rome, continued to shape Russian self-perception long after Ivan's death. Even his obsession with expanding cultural knowledge had effects beyond his lifetime. Ivan oversaw the introduction of Russia's first printing press, a monumental step that allowed scriptures, legal texts, and religious teachings to be distributed more widely. Though the printer Ivan Fyodorov later fled due to court intrigue, the innovation he introduced continued to influence literacy and record-keeping for generations. The Tsar who ruled through fear had paradoxically helped lay the foundation for greater access to information. Economically, Ivan's reforms aimed at improving tax collection and land management persisted despite instability. The redistribution of lands, though often enforced brutally, had long-term consequences for social structure. The gradual transformation of peasants into serfs accelerated during Ivan's reign, shaping centuries of Russian society. While this was not a positive legacy, it was undeniably enduring. It formalized the feudal hierarchy in ways that would remain deeply embedded until the 19th century. Yet the contrast between Ivan's reforms and his later actions created a strange duality in his legacy. On one side, he had weakened the boyars' arbitrary power, established legal standards, restructured the military, expanded territory, and laid foundations for centralized governance. On the other side, he had decimated noble families, disrupted administrative continuity through terror, and hollowed out the very institutions he once strengthened. This contradiction was not lost on those who lived through his reign. Many wondered how the same ruler who built could also destroy so completely. But the answer lay in Ivan's inner turmoil. His reforms were products of clarity, ambition, and youthful vision. His later violence was a product of loss, fear, and emotional collapse. The two versions of Ivan existed side by side, shaping Russia in both constructive and destructive ways. In the quiet hours of his late reign, Ivan sometimes spoke wistfully of the achievements of his early years. Courtiers described him reminiscing about the reforms he had once shepherded with pride: improved governance, expanding borders, growing culture. These moments revealed the sorrowful truth that Ivan was painfully aware of his own transformation. He knew his early accomplishments were overshadowed, even threatened, by his later behavior. He understood that the Russia he envisioned had been warped by his own hand. And yet, despite the damage, the core of his legacy endured. The centralized power he created became the backbone of future Russian rulers. The military innovations he introduced shaped Russia's defenses for generations. The territorial gains he secured opened pathways for imperial expansion. The legal reforms he enacted remained embedded in governance long after his death. As Ivan aged, the empire around him bore both the scars of his rage and the structure of his vision. It was a nation tempered by terror but strengthened by reform, traumatized yet unified, weighed down by history yet reshaped by ambition. The contradictions of his rule formed a complex foundation, one that would challenge, inspire, and terrify the rulers who followed him. And as the final chapters of his life approached, Ivan remained trapped between what he had built and what he had broken, haunted by the knowledge that the legacy he would leave behind was destined to be just as divided as he was. The end of Ivan's life did not arrive with the dramatic force that had defined so many of his actions. It crept in quietly, almost softly, like a shadow stretching across the floor as evening settles into night. For a man whose reign had been marked by thunderous decisions, fierce battles, and violent displays of power, his final days seemed strangely muted. The Tsar who once commanded armies, who inspired terror with a single glance, now moved through the palace with a weariness that even he could no longer hide. By this time, Ivan was not the man he had once been. His body had weakened, years of stress, illness, and emotional turmoil had carved deep lines into his face and left his frame thinner, more fragile. His beard, once dark and imposing, had grown streaked with white. His eyes, though still sharp, carried a depth of exhaustion that seemed to reach beyond age. The protector of Russia, the architect of its greatest reforms and its darkest horrors, had become a tired old ruler burdened by the ghosts of his past. In these final months, the Kremlin had settled into a strange stillness. The Oprichniki no longer rode in terrifying formations. The purges that once shook the country had slowed. Yet the weight of suspicion still lingered around the palace like a cold fog. Ivan continued to distrust those around him, though the flames of paranoia had dimmed into embers rather than roaring fires. He spent long hours in prayer, clutching religious icons, searching for forgiveness in scriptures and hymns. His health deteriorated gradually. Some days he felt strong enough to attend council meetings, other days he remained confined to his chambers, pale and trembling. Physicians tried their best, bleeding, herbs, poultices, prayers, but their efforts offered little more than temporary relief. Even his closest advisors could see that the Tsar's body was failing him. And though no one dared say it aloud, all felt that the end was drawing near. Despite his weakness, Ivan maintained a curious determination to carry on with his duties. He still reviewed documents, signed decrees, and listened to reports from military commanders. He worried constantly about the future of the dynasty. His surviving son, Fifer, was gentle and pious but lacked the strength of character needed to rule such a vast and turbulent realm. Ivan knew this, knew it too well, and the realization tormented him. The heir he had killed in a moment of rage haunted him continuously, a reminder of the future he had destroyed with his own hands. In these final days, Ivan turned increasingly to simple routines, rituals that brought him brief comfort. One of these was chess. The game had always fascinated him, the strategy, the control, the sense of command over a battlefield even when his body could no longer ride into war. He played often with courtiers, monks, and sometimes foreign guests. It was during one of these chess games that history would mark his final moments. On a cold March day in 1584, Ivan took his place in the royal chambers to play a match against Bogdan Belsky, one of his trusted companions. The air in the room was calm, almost eerily peaceful. Candles flickered softly. The heavy curtains muffled the sounds of distant footsteps. For a while it was simply two men concentrating on the board before them, one moving pieces with slow deliberation, the other watching carefully, noting the Tsar's labored breathing. As they played, Ivan spoke occasionally, muttering observations about strategy or making quiet remarks about the game. His hands shook slightly when he lifted the chess pieces, and he paused often to catch his breath. Yet despite the frailty in his movements, his mind remained sharp. He anticipated moves, countered them, and discussed alternate possibilities. He was still the thinker, the tactician, the ruler who once outmaneuvered entire armies. Then, without warning, something changed. Ivan reached forward to make a move, but his hand froze midair. His fingers clenched around the piece, and his eyes widened, not in fear, but in sudden, overwhelming pain. A moment later, his body convulsed. The chess piece slipped from his grasp and clattered softly onto the board. Before Belsky could react, the Tsar collapsed backward, his limbs trembling, his face drained of color. Panic rippled through the chamber. Servants rushed forward, calling for help. Physicians hurried in, fumbling with their tools. But the Tsar's condition worsened with terrifying speed. He struggled to breathe, gasping as if the air itself had turned to stone. His pulse weakened. His skin grew cold. And then, in a moment so quiet it was almost gentle, his struggling ceased. Ivan IV, Tsar of all Russia, took his final breath. The room fell silent. Those present stared at the still figure before them, a man who had reshaped an empire, who had carried the weight of trauma and ambition, who had lived as both savior and tyrant. His lifeless hand lay near the chessboard, fingers curled slightly inward, as though reaching for one final move he would never make. Outside, the Kremlin remained hushed, unaware of the history unfolding within. Snowflakes drifted through the air, settling softly on rooftops. The bells, still silent from years of oppressive rule, would soon toll for the passing of a monarch whose shadow had loomed over Russia for half a century. In the aftermath of Ivan's death, those closest to him felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, fear, uncertainty. The ruler who had dominated their lives was gone. Yet his absence did not immediately bring peace. Instead, it left behind questions, wounds, and a fragile nation bracing for what would come next. The end of Ivan's life had been quiet, almost surprisingly so, considering the thunderous storm he had been in life. But this stillness, this gentle collapse at a chessboard, felt fitting in its own way. It marked the final chapter of a man who had lived in extremes, a man who carried immense intelligence and unbearable affliction, a man whose legacy would continue to divide scholars, terrify history, and linger in the collective memory of a nation for centuries. Russia had lost its Tsar. And though the snow continued to fall over Moscow, something in the air had shifted forever. When word of Ivan's death spread across Russia, the reaction was anything but simple. The nation had lived under his rule for decades, some had feared him, some had respected him, and many had felt both emotions at once. Now that he was gone, the silence that followed seemed heavy, uncertain, as though the land itself was deciding how to remember a ruler who had shaped its destiny in ways both heroic and horrifying. Among the common people, memories were mixed. Many villagers saw Ivan as the first ruler who challenged the boyars and defended the poor. Their stories transformed him into a stern but necessary protector, harsh, yes, but fair in a world full of corruption. Others remembered the burdens of war, the endless taxes, and the sudden disappearances. Their grief was overshadowed by the trauma they still carried. The nobility felt an equally complex wave of emotions. Some families had been devastated by the Oprichnina. Estates lost, relatives executed, futures shattered. These wounds did not fade just because the Tsar had. Yet even they felt uneasy. With Ivan gone, the throne passed to his gentle, inexperienced son, Feofor. Russia's future suddenly seemed fragile. The boyars feared the chaos that might follow a weak ruler, chaos made worse because the Tsarevich Ivan, the capable heir, had died by his father's hand. Foreign rulers received the news with fascination. European ambassadors had written conflicting accounts for years, some describing Ivan as brilliant and politically sharp, others portraying him as a dangerous madman. His death confirmed one thing: Russia was unpredictable. Some nations saw opportunity, others braced for instability. Artists, clergy, and scholars quickly began shaping Ivan's memory. Some emphasized his cruelty, others highlighted his intelligence and faith. The debate became endless, echoing across borders and generations. In the end, the world did not mourn Ivan in one voice. His death left a question rather than an answer: was he Russia's savior, or its tormentor? In the years after Ivan's death, the man faded, but the legend grew. Stories about him traveled from village to village, whispered by firelight and echoed in dim marketplaces. People who had once feared speaking his name now shaped it into tales meant to warn, to teach, or to simply make sense of a ruler who defied simple judgment. And in those stories, truth blended with imagination until Ivan IV became larger than any single fact could contain. In Novgorod, where his wrath had scarred the land, elders swore that the river still carried echoes of the past, the sound of boots on ice, faint cries drifting beneath winter winds, ghostly shapes moving just beyond lantern light. Whether born of trauma or superstition, these stories kept the memory of his terror alive. In Moscow, the myth revolved around the Oprichniki. Parents frightened misbehaving children with tales of black-clad riders who appeared at night to punish the wicked. Some insisted they still roamed the city's outskirts, cursed to wander eternally for the sins they committed in the Tsar's name. Ivan himself became a figure of contradiction in legend. Foreigners painted him as the ultimate tyrant, cruel, unpredictable, demonic. Yet Russian folk tales often portrayed him differently, as a strict but just ruler, clever enough to outwit corrupt nobles and brave enough to defend the poor. These stories softened his image, turning him into a symbol of harsh fairness rather than mindless brutality. Artists and writers later added their own interpretations, each layer reshaping the legend. Some emphasized his madness, others highlighted his intelligence or spiritual torment. Over time, the man vanished behind the myth. And so, Ivan the Terrible became timeless, not simply a ruler, but a shadow woven into Russia's cultural memory. When history looks back at Ivan IV, it does not see a simple villain or a misunderstood hero, it sees a paradox. His life was a collision of brilliance and brutality, vision and paranoia, strength and self-destruction. No ruler before him had shaped Russia so powerfully, yet none had wounded it so deeply. His early years promised greatness. Through reforms, legal codes, military restructuring, and territorial expansion, he laid foundations that would support the Russian state for centuries. In these achievements, one glimpses the ruler he might have been, disciplined, insightful, driven by the desire to strengthen his nation. But the tragedies that marked his life, childhood trauma, political betrayal, and above all, the death of Anastasia, twisted those ambitions. Fear replaced hope. Suspicion replaced trust. The Oprichnina emerged as both a weapon and a wound, reshaping Russia through terror that left scars across generations. His later years revealed a man haunted by what he had done, trapped between remorse and rage. The death of his son shattered whatever balance remained in him, leaving the Tsar spiritually adrift, desperately seeking forgiveness yet unable to escape the shadows he himself had created. And so his legacy became divided. One side, the builder of a centralized Russian state. The other, the architect of suffering and instability. Future rulers would invoke his name as caution, as inspiration, or as warning. Historians still debate him: was he necessary for Russia's survival, or the cause of its darkest era? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Ivan the Terrible remains a reminder of the dangerous path between power and paranoia. He shows how a single ruler can elevate a nation, and how the demons within that ruler can bring it to its knees. His story endures because it forces us to look at the human heart beneath the crown, and the terrible cost when that heart is left to battle its darkness alone.